This cowboy rests by a fence in 1877. Zooming in on his boots exposes the dark truth. Dr. William Hayes had seen thousands of photographs from the American frontier, but this one made him pause. The image showed a lone cowboy resting against a weathered fence somewhere in the Dakota Territory. Dated 1877, the man wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his face partially shadowed. His posture suggested exhaustion, one leg stretched out, the other bent, hands resting loosely on his knees. Behind him, endless prairie grass swayed under what must have been a fierce wind captured in that single frozen moment. The photograph had arrived at the Montana Historical Society in a dusty cardboard box, donated by the estate of a woman named Ruth. No other context, no names, no location beyond Dakota Territory, 1877, scrawled on the back in faded pencil. William adjusted his desk lamp and pulled the magnifying glass closer. Something about the image unsettled him, though he couldn't say what. The cowboy looked ordinary enough, weathered face, standard clothing of the period, a rifle propped against the fence beside him. Yet there was an odd stillness to the scene, as if the camera had captured more than just a moment of rest. He scanned the photograph into his computer, preparing to catalog it with the others. As the high-resolution image appeared on his monitor, he zoomed in slowly, examining each detail. The fence posts were rough-hewn timber, probably cottonwood. The rifle appeared to be a Winchester model, 1873. The cowboy's clothing was trail-worn, but intact. Then William's cursor drifted down to the man's boots. His breath caught. He zoomed in further, his pulse quickening. The left boot, there was something on it, something dark, something that shouldn't be there. Blood, dried blood, spattered across the leather in an unmistakable pattern. But not just any blood. The pattern told a story of violence. William leaned closer to the monitor, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the contrast and brightness. The blood spatter on the cowboy's left boot became clearer, more defined. It wasn't a simple smear from butchering an animal or a minor injury. The pattern was specific cast-off spatter, the kind that comes from a weapon being swung repeatedly. He had consulted on enough forensic history cases to recognize it immediately. This was high-velocity impact spatter, consistent with blunt force trauma or close-range shooting. The droplets formed an arc across the boot's instep and up onto the lower leg of the cowboy's trousers. William grabbed his phone and called his colleague, Dr. Sarah Chun, a forensic anthropologist who specialized in historical crime scenes. She arrived within the hour, her curiosity piqued by the urgency in his voice. "Look at this," William said, gesturing to the screen. Sarah studied the image for several long moments, her expression growing more serious. "That's definite blood spatter. See how the droplets are elongated here?" She pointed to several spots. "That indicates movement, either the victim moving away or the assailant moving toward. And these smaller satellite droplets around the larger ones? That's characteristic of impact spatter. Could it be from hunting?" William asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah shook her head. "Wrong pattern entirely. Hunting would give you smears, maybe some drips. This is violent trauma, multiple impacts." She zoomed in further. "And look here, do you see this? On the side of his other boot?" William felt his stomach tighten. There, barely visible on the right boot, was a different kind of stain. Drag marks, as if the cowboy had stood in a pool of blood and then walked through it. "Whoever this man was," Sarah said quietly, "he was present at someone's murder. The question is, was he the killer or a witness?" William couldn't sleep that night. The photograph haunted him. The cowboy's shadowed face, the blood on his boots, the eerie stillness of that prairie fence. At 3 a.m, he returned to his office and began searching through the donation records. The box had come from Ruth's estate, but there had to be more. He pulled up the paperwork. Ruth Mackenzie, deceased at 91, no living relatives. Her great-grandfather had been a rancher in the Dakota Territory during the 1870s. A state attorney had simply cleared out her house and donated anything historical to the museum. William made a note to visit the attorney first thing in the morning, but he couldn't wait. He opened the Historical Archives database and began searching for unsolved murders in the Dakota Territory. In 1,877. The results were surprisingly numerous. The frontier was a violent place-claim disputes, cattle rustling, revenge killings, and random violence were common. Law enforcement was sparse, and many crimes went uninvestigated or unsolved. He narrowed the search to the summer months, reasoning that the prairie grass in the photograph looked like late spring or early summer growth. 3 cases caught his attention. A homesteader named Jacob found beaten to death near the Cheyenne River in June. A traveling merchant discovered with his throat cut outside a trading post in July, and a U.S. Marshal named Thomas Reed shot twice and left for dead on the open prairie in August, though he survived long enough to give a statement before dying of his wounds. William's instincts pulled him toward the Marshal's case. Law enforcement murders were always significant, always investigated more thoroughly. He pulled up Marshal Reed's file. The report was handwritten, nearly illegible, but William worked through it slowly. Reed had been pursuing a group of cattle rustlers when he was ambushed. He described his attackers as 3 men, possibly 4. Before losing consciousness, he mentioned one detail that made William's blood run cold. The tall one ... had a scar across his left hand. William zoomed back to the photograph. The cowboy's left hand rested on his knee, partially visible beneath his hat brim. There, barely noticeable in the original image, but clearer in high resolution, was a long, pale scar running across the back of his left hand. William arrived at the county records office in Rapid City before it opened, coffee in hand, his briefcase stuffed with printed documents. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Morrison, recognized him from previous research visits and unlocked the door early. "You look like you haven't slept," she observed. "I haven't," William admitted. "I need everything you have on you, S. Marshal Thomas Reed. Death date August 1877. Mrs. Morrison disappeared into the back room and returned 20 minutes later with a leather-bound ledger and 2 boxes of loose papers. Reed was a big case back then. They never caught who did it. His murder was one of the reasons the territorial governor pushed for more federal marshals in the Yale region. William spread the documents across the reading table. The marshal's final statement had been recorded by a local doctor who tried to save him. The handwriting was shaky. The ink faded to brown, but the words were legible. 3 men, maybe 4. Ambushed me near Willow Creek. They wanted to know where I'd hidden the evidence. I wouldn't tell them. The tall one with the scar on his hand, he shot me first. Sighed I was dead either way. They took my horse, my badge, and my rifle. Left me for the buzzards. The statement continued, describing the location and the marshal's desperate crawl toward help. He'd made it nearly 2 miles before a rancher found him. He died 6 hours later. William's hands shook as he read. The rifle. Reed's rifle had been taken. He zoomed in on the photograph again, focusing on the Winchester model, 1873, leaning against the fence beside the cowboy. He pulled up reference images of period rifles. The model 1873 was common, but law enforcement versions often had specific markings. He enhanced the photograph's rifle section, adjusting contrast and sharpness until details emerged. There, carved into the stock just below the receiver, were initials, T.R. Thomas Reed. The cowboy in the photograph wasn't just present at a murder. He was holding the murder weapon. He had taken the dead marshal's rifle and posed with it like a trophy. William's mind raced. This wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was a confession captured on film, preserved for nearly 150 years, waiting to be discovered. William knew he needed more context. The photograph's location, that specific fence, that stretch of prairie, might still be identifiable. He contacted a local historian named Robert, who specialized in frontier ranches and homesteads. They met at a diner on the outskirts of town. Robert spread a collection of old survey maps across the table, each marked with property boundaries from the 1870s. Ruth's great-grandfather was named Joseph, Robert said. He had a ranch about 30 miles north of here, near Willow Creek. William's heart skipped. Willow Creek, the same location where Marshal Reed had been ambushed. Joseph had a daughter, Robert continued, pulling out a faded newspaper clipping from 1878. Her name was Eleanor. She married a man named Henry in 1879. Look at the wedding announcement. William scanned the text. Miss Eleanor, daughter of rancher Joseph, wed to Mr. Henry of Wyoming Territory. But it was the photograph accompanying the announcement that stopped him cold. The bride and groom stood stiffly before the camera, typical of the era. But the groom Henry looked hauntingly familiar. Same build, same facial structure, same piercing eyes. William placed his modern print of the cowboy photograph beside the newspaper clipping, even accounting for 2 years' difference in formal wedding attire versus trail clothes. The resemblance was undeniable. "That's him," William whispered. "The cowboy in the photograph is Eleanor's husband, Henry." Robert nodded slowly. Joseph's ranch records mention Henry working as a hired hand in 1877, the summer before he married Eleanor. He was there during the marshal's murder. William's mind raced through the implications. Henry had been at Joseph's ranch. The ranch was near where Reed was killed. Henry had Reed's rifle and blood on his boots. And then, a year later, he married the rancher's daughter. Did Joseph have any trouble with the law? William asked. Robert's expression darkened. Joseph was investigated for cattle rustling multiple times, but never charged. Marshal Reed was reportedly gathering evidence against him when he was killed. The pieces were falling into place. Henry wasn't just a murderer. He might have killed to protect his employer, the man who had become his father-in-law. William returned to Ruth's estate attorney, armed with new information. "I need to know if there were any personal papers, diaries, or letters in Ruth's house. Anything from her great-grandmother Eleanor." The attorney made some calls and reported back within a day. "There's a storage unit. Ruth kept boxes of family documents she never sorted through. You're welcome to examine them." The storage unit was climate-controlled, packed with furniture and boxes. William spent hours searching until he found what he was looking for, a small trunk with Eleanor's initials carved into the lid. Inside were letters, pressed flowers, and 3 leather-bound diaries spanning from 1875 to 1881. William handled them carefully, aware he was holding pieces of a woman's life frozen in time. He opened the 1877 diary with trembling hands. The entries were mundane at first: daily chores, weather observations, visits from neighbors. But in late July, the tone shifted. "Father has been worried. The marshal came by again, asking questions about the cattle. He doesn't believe Father's records. Henry says the marshal is dangerous, that he'll ruin us even if Father's done nothing wrong. I've never seen Henry so angry." William flipped forward. August 14th, 1877. "Something terrible has happened. The marshal is dead. They found him near Willow Creek, shot and left to die. Father won't speak of it. Henry has been quiet, distant. He burned his clothes yesterday, said they were ruined from working with the livestock, but I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't about clothes." The next entry was dated 3 days later. "I found blood on Henry's spare boots. I asked him about it. He said it was from butchering a calf, but we haven't butchered any calves. When I pressed him, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise and told me to never ask again. I'm frightened. What has he done?" William's pulse raced. Eleanor had known. She'd suspected her future husband of murder, but she'd married him anyway. Why? He continued reading, finding the answer 2 weeks later. "Father says I must marry Henry. He says Henry protected our family, that we owe him everything. He says if I don't marry him, Henry might talk to the authorities about Father's business. I feel trapped." Eleanor hadn't married for love. She'd been coerced into marriage to buy Henry's silence and loyalty. The photograph wasn't just evidence of murder. It was evidence of a woman's life destroyed by it. William returned to the original donation box, searching for anything else connected to the cowboy photograph. At the bottom, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, he found a second photograph. This one showed a family: Henry, Eleanor, and 2 young children, taken around 1885. They stood before a modest house, Eleanor's expression hollow and distant. Henry's hand rested possessively on her shoulder. But it was what William noticed in the background that made his breath catch. There, hanging on the wall of the house behind them, was the Winchester rifle, Marshal Reed's rifle. Henry had kept it, displayed it like a prize. William showed Sarah the photograph. He kept the murder weapon for years. He lived with it, raised his children with it on the wall. How could Eleanor bear it? Sarah studied Eleanor's face in the photograph. Look at her eyes. She's looking directly at the camera, not at her family. It's like she's trying to tell someone trying to leave evidence. William felt a chill. You think she wanted the truth discovered? I think she lived in hell, Sarah said quietly. Married to her father's enforcer, knowing what he'd done, unable to escape. Maybe these photographs were her way of leaving a record. William returned to Eleanor's diaries, reading through the later years. The entries became shorter, more cryptic, filled with sorrow. I dream of the marshal's face. Henry speaks of him sometimes when he's been drinking, laughing about how easy it was. I wonder if his widow still grieves. My son has Henry's eyes. I pray he doesn't have his soul. 20 years married, 20 years of living with a killer. When will it end? The final entry was dated 1896. Henry is sick. The doctor says he won't last the year. I should feel sorrow, but I feel only relief. When he's gone, perhaps I can finally breathe. I've hidden the truth in plain sight all these years. Someday, someone will see it. Someday, justice will find him, even if only in memory. William sat back, overwhelmed. Eleanor had indeed left a record. The photographs, carefully preserved and passed down through her descendants, were her testimony. The blood on Henry's boots, the stolen rifle, the haunted look in her eyes, all of it was evidence, waiting decades for someone to finally see it. William knew he couldn't keep this discovery to himself. Marshal Thomas Reed had been a real person, with family, with people who'd mourned him. He owed it to Reed's memory to find them. He searched genealogical records and found that Reed had been married with 3 children when he died. His widow, Catherine, had never remarried. She'd raised the children alone, moved to Montana, and died in 1909. One of Reed's descendants, a great-great-granddaughter named Patricia, still lived in Billings. William contacted her through the Historical Society, explaining what he'd found. Patricia arrived at his office 2 days later, elderly but sharp-eyed. She carried a small wooden box. My grandmother told me stories about Thomas, Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. How he was murdered by cattle rustlers and how the killers were never caught. It destroyed my great-great-grandmother. She spent the rest of her life seeking justice that never came. William showed her the photographs, both the cowboy image with the blood-stained boots and the family portrait with the rifle on the wall. Patricia's hand went to her mouth. That's his rifle. I'd recognize it anywhere. My grandmother kept his badge and a photograph of him holding that exact rifle. The initials on the stock, he carved them himself. She opened the wooden box, revealing Marshal Reed's tarnished badge and a faded photograph of him in uniform, the Winchester cradled in his arms. The rifle was unmistakable, same wood grain pattern, same carved initials, same brass tacks in the stock. Who was this man? Patricia asked, pointing to Henry in the photograph. Who murdered my ancestor? William told her everything, about Henry, about Joseph's ranch, about Eleanor's diaries, about the forced marriage and the decades of silence. Patricia wept quietly. All these years we never knew. Catherine died not knowing. My grandmother died not knowing. And this man, this Henry, he lived free, raised a family, grew old in peace. Not in peace, William said gently. Eleanor's diaries make that clear. He drank heavily, was violent, died in pain. And Eleanor, she suffered most of all. Patricia wiped her eyes. What happens now? Now, William said, we tell the truth. We make sure Thomas Reed's story is known, that his murder is finally solved. Even if justice comes 150 years too late, William organized a press conference at the Montana Historical Society. The room filled with journalists, historians, and Reed family descendants. He prepared a presentation, the photographs side by side, Eleanor's diary entries, forensic analysis of the blood spatter, documentation of the stolen rifle. As he spoke, showing each piece of evidence, the room fell silent. The story unfolded like a mystery novel, but with the weight of real lives, real tragedy, real injustice. Henry murdered Marshal Thomas Reed on August 12, 1877, near Willow Creek, William concluded. He killed Reed to protect rancher Joseph from a cattle rustling investigation. As payment for his silence and loyalty, Henry was given Joseph's daughter, Eleanor, in marriage, a transaction that destroyed her life. He displayed the cowboy photograph on a large screen, zoomed in on the blood-stained boots. This photograph, taken shortly after the murder, is Henry's confession. The blood spatter pattern matches violent trauma. The rifle is Reed's stolen weapon. The scar on his hand matches Marshall Reed's dying description of his killer. Patricia stood and addressed the crowd, her voice steady despite her emotion. For 150 years, my family believed Thomas Reed's killers escaped justice. Today, we finally know the truth. Henry may never have faced trial, may never have been punished in his lifetime, but history will remember him as a murderer, and it will remember Thomas Reed as a lawman who died doing his duty. A press conference made national news. The photographs went viral, analyzed, and shared across social media. Forensic experts confirmed William's findings. The case, though long closed by time, was officially updated in territorial records to name Henry as Marshall Reed's killer. But for William, the most important moment came afterward, in the quiet of his office. Sarah sat across from him, reviewing Eleanor's final diary entry once more. She knew, Sarah said softly. She knew someone would eventually see it. That's why she preserved everything: the photographs, the diaries, the rifle. She left a trail. She lived her whole life trapped by what Henry did, William said. She couldn't speak openly, couldn't go to the authorities without implicating her father. So she left evidence. And now, more than a century later, her testimony has finally been heard. 3 months after the revelation, William stood in the Montana Historical Society's new exhibit. Justice delayed, the Marshall Reed murder, and the evidence hidden in plain sight. The centerpiece was the cowboy photograph, dramatically enlarged, with the blood-stained boots highlighted. Beside it hung the family portrait, with the stolen rifle on the wall. Eleanor's diary pages were displayed in protective cases, her words finally public, her silent testimony finally heard. Patricia had donated Marshall Reed's badge and photograph to the exhibit. They hung in a place of honor, accompanied by Reed's service record and tributes from law enforcement organizations across the country. But what moved William most was a new addition, created by Patricia and her family. A memorial stone placed at the site near Willow Creek where Reed had been shot. The inscription read, U.S. Marshal Thomas Reed, 1841 to 1877. He died seeking justice. Truth took 150 years, but it finally came. William had attended the dedication ceremony. Dozens of people had gathered: Reed descendants, law enforcement officers, historians, and locals. They'd stood in the prairie wind near that same weathered fence line and remembered a man whose murder had been forgotten for more than a century. Later, back at the exhibit, a young woman approached William. She introduced herself as Claire, Ruth's second cousin, a distant relative of Eleanor. I wanted to thank you, Claire said. Growing up, we heard family stories about Eleanor being unhappy in her marriage, but no one knew why. Now we understand. She was brave in her own way, wasn't she? Leaving evidence, preserving the truth even when she couldn't speak it. William nodded. She was trapped by circumstance, but she refused to let Henry's crime be forgotten. This photograph, he gestured to the cowboy image, looks like a man resting by a fence. But it's actually a confession, a testimony, and a woman's rebellion all in one. Claire studied the photograph for a long moment. Do you think she found peace? I think, William said carefully, she found a way to fight back with the only weapons she had: memory, evidence, and hope that someday someone would look close enough to see the truth. As visitors moved through the exhibit, reading Eleanor's words and examining the photographs, William felt a deep satisfaction. The photograph of a cowboy resting by a fence in 1877 had seemed unremarkable at first glance, just another snapshot of frontier life. But by zooming in, by asking questions, by refusing to accept the obvious explanation, the truth had emerged. Marshal Thomas Reed's murder was finally solved. Henry's crime was finally exposed, and Eleanor's silent testimony was finally heard. The photograph would hang in the museum for years to come, a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, can arrive even across the chasm of centuries. And that sometimes the darkest truths hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to look close enough to see them. As the sun set through the museum windows, casting long shadows across the exhibit, William took one final look at the cowboy's face in the photograph. That shadowed expression, that casual posture, it had hidden murder for 150 years. But no longer. The boots had told their story. The blood had spoken, and history had finally listened.